You're welcome to the Economy and Politics Show. I'm Ottoabasi Abasiekong. This edition will discuss fiscal reforms and the pathway for inclusive economic growth in Nigeria. Joining me virtually for this conversation is Dr. Ogho Okiti, an economist and CEO of ThinkBusiness Nigeria. It's great to have you once again on the show.
Thank you so very much, Otto. I'm always delighted to be here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Let's begin with your perspective on the national minimum wage, still a burning issue in the economic space. The President, Bola Tinubu, GCFR, in his June 12 broadcast, said an executive bill on the new minimum wage bill will be sent to the National Assembly soon. We hope that will be quick because of the situation in the country. But organized labor, on their part, wants consultation with the National Assembly when they receive that bill to ensure that it's a win-win situation before it is passed and signed into law. What is your perspective so far in the negotiations, the propositions, and the implications for the economy at large?
The problem with the minimum wage is not about the level of the minimum wage or the agitations of the labor unions. The problem, the reason why we have a very chaotic and disruptive and inefficient minimum wage adjustment in Nigeria is because we have not got the process right. So when this process, the ongoing one, when it is concluded, if we do not actually legislate, that is, come up with a new legislation and define how we will adjust the minimum wage going forward, I can assure you that we'll be back in this crisis again over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Because we were here before. But Nigeria, we never learn from the past. We don't learn from history, even though the history is just right in front of us. In 2018, there were strikes, there were agitations before it was increased to 30,000 per month. This time, it's the same thing. So the focus should be on what is the process that works. Everywhere else in the world where you have a minimum wage, there are some very critical criteria. One is that there must be a standing committee. So the legislation that I expect, or that I would have encouraged the government to embark on, will have a standing committee. That standing committee will be defined on how often the minimum wage will be adjusted. Some countries, they do it every year. Some countries, they do it every 2 years. Some countries, they do it every 3 years. So that standing committee should know that at this time, they have to adjust the minimum wage. But if you look at Nigeria's minimum wage, the first one, by the way, was 1981. And the last one was 2018. But before then, you have 1981, you have 1991, then you have the one 1999, you have 2000, you have 2001, and then you have 2013, and you have 2018. So it's very haphazard. You don't do minimum wage like that. So the process is the problem. So the second point is this, about Nigeria's minimum wage. And I've argued this, and I'm doing another podcast on this. The problem with Nigeria's minimum wage is that, why do you have a minimum wage for the month? The minimum wage should be per hour, because the problem with a monthly minimum wage is that the work process of the artisans, of cleaners, of security, of people that actually work in that minimum wage zone, their work is actually not defined, because they don't work per month. They're supposed to work per hour. So for instance, if I'm a cleaner, and I was a cleaner in the United Kingdom, so I could work 2 hours here, I could work 3 hours here, and I could work 4 hours there. So I could collect my minimum wage from here, my minimum wage from there, and at the end of the day, I'm able to actually increase my income. But because you have set the minimum wage per month, it means that I'm stuck with an employer for the month, because I'm waiting for my monthly salary. So it is the process. So when we have a new minimum wage, the government should now put in place a very strong and tight, defined process for adjusting Nigeria's minimum wage. Then we can begin to make progress.
Dr. Okiti, you've brought something very fundamental They just concluded platform, platform conversation on policy and national issues convened by the Covenant
Yes.
Nation. Mr. Babatunde Raji Fashola, former Minister of Works and Housing. We need to be very clear the difference between minimum wage and salary. And just like you rightly said, he talked about per hour and all that. So that means that we need to really look at the legislation holistically. And this is what we expect National Assembly to do wider consultations when they receive that bill so that we can really have something very inclusive, like you said. So we'll keep an eye on that bill once it's sent to National Assembly, hopefully.
No. The president is definitely not going to send that bill because I don't think they're working on such a bill. The president is sent a bill for
just for minimum
2,000 just to solve the immediate problem. But I am saying that immediately after solving the immediate problem, and we try and solve the problem long term. By the way, there's a third feature. I've told you about two features. The third feature that a minimum wage legislation should have is that it's okay for us to have a national minimum wage, but we should take into consideration that the Nigerian economy is not homogeneous. So the minimum wage in Lagos cannot be the minimum wage in Abia State. The minimum wage in Abia cannot be the minimum wage in Zamfara. So in Sokoto, for instance, just imagine in Sokoto, there, I mean, what kind of minimum wage are you going to do in Sokoto for 62,000? Which business? They are probably all farmers. So you need to take into consideration farm incomes. You need to take into consideration farm workers. You need to take into consideration civil servants. You need to take into some different kind of skills. You need to even take into consideration age. That means that there are people that are actually employed as interns. Are those ones going to be employing 62,000 as well? So those are the considerations that the legislation to take into. But this is the summary. Let me also say this because it's also very important, because somebody may be thinking that, oh, I actually think 62,000 is too big as a minimum wage. No, 62,000 is actually ridiculous as a minimum wage. So
at this time,
it's actually totally ridiculous. And let me make another point. The government that is putting forward the 62,000, there is a classic problem with this particular government, especially the President Bola Ahmed Tinubu government. That classic problem keeps coming up in every issue they are trying to solve. And this is that classic problem. There is the notion that the way the optics don't matter. The optics don't matter. I don't know whether they think it matters, but that is the notion, that is the impression that we all get from here, that the optics don't matter. That means the government can continue to spend like a drunken sailor while the public and the general public continue to make the sacrifices. That's not sustainable.
It's not sustainable indeed. And to all our viewers, we just want to clarify that the bill that President Tinubu is sending to the National Assembly is around the current negotiations around the national minimum wage. But of course, Dr. Ogho Okiti is calling for some reform again in the whole process, whereby we can look at per hour minimum wage. And that clarity, like I raised from former governor of Lagos, Mr. Raji Fashola, we should understand the difference between minimum wage and salary. So those are very important things so we can begin to be more productive. I think that's another issue that you've fundamentally raised, Dr. Ogho Okiti. Productivity must be tied to things like this, and that does make the economy prosperous and inclusive. So, Doctor, let's go on to the recommendations of the Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms Committee. This conversation is around reforms and how you can move the economy forward. I know you're also a big advocate for reforms, especially institutions. I hear you a lot talk about that, and in your capacity once advising government too. But there's a fundamental part here where the committee is recommending a reduction of taxes. I mean, tax alone is a major challenge. Over 60 taxes, official and unofficial, could be almost 100 that we have in the country, but they're asking for a single digit between eight official ones, and of course, the additional one they put is like a contribution, like CSR. What's your thought on this need to have a single-digit tax regime, which is a way of saying that we want to improve ease of doing business for the business environment and economy?
I've said this also before. I mean, as you said, I've said this, I've argued extensively. Our tax, there are two major problems with tax, or let me say with government finances in Nigeria today. And or you can even say three. And it's very, very important that the fiscal Fiscal Policy Committee attempts, at least they attempt to deal with these three problems. One is that the government does not have adequate resources. So that is number one. If you use the non-oil tax as a ratio of GDP, the government does not have enough, the government is not collecting enough taxes. So that's number one. Number two, and you can probably say, I probably reach for now, the number two, obviously, the one that is collected is not effective, there's too much leakages. That's number two. Number three, the taxes are actually concentrated. So you need to actually broaden the number of people that actually pay taxes. And one way of knowing that the taxes are concentrated is that it's only in Nigeria or maybe one or two other countries that you have taxes that have, the dominant taxes being collected is actually corporate taxes. Whereas in many other countries, the taxes that you actually collect that actually finance the government is actually personal income tax. So that's three. And of course, number four is that we actually also have taxes that are collected by non-state actors. And we don't know where those money goes to. You know, I mean, for instance, you only need to take transport from, if you take transport from Lekki, where I live here, don't travel in your car, just take transport from Lekki, and you take transport to Bega. Maybe you take about 2-3 buses to Bega. You will find that at every bus stop, somebody is collecting 200. Where is that money going to? That's taxes. If you also look around, I see them around Lekki at all. As you see boys without uniforms, they just stop vehicles in the middle of the road and they collect money. Where are those monies going to? So those monies are actually also not. So those are the problem with taxes in Nigeria. So if you have that kind of situation and you have a committee that is trying to address it, I am not surprised that the first thing they want to do is streamline those taxes. Yes. So that's the starting place. Now, when they are able to streamline and define few number of taxes, the expectation is that they are now able to align those taxes to whoever is collecting those taxes, and there's a greater level of clarity, a greater level of transparency, and hopefully there will now be a greater level of accountability. And by the time you are able to put in place those three things within the tax system, the expectation is you are able to actually expand the tax resources that comes to the government, and in the process, and I hope this is the final thing, we are able to strengthen democracy, because that way I probably know where my money is going to and I know who to hold responsible. So I welcome those reforms.
I mean, I like the last part you said, the issue of transparency. And in addition to that, Dr. Okiti, the issue of reducing the revenue collecting agencies to one, they proposed that the Federal Inland Revenue Service will be renamed as Nigerian Revenue Service. But I mean, personally for me, I always ask myself, why do we have so many revenue collecting agencies in the country? So having just one FIRS, if that is approved, transiting to NRS as the singular revenue collecting agency would bring efficiency. Do you see, we need political will in that regard. Do you see that possibility? Because political will is very critical in doing this, so that all these regulators and other players in the economy will begin to focus on what they are supposed to do. Customs will begin to focus more on trade facilitation. Regulators in the financial and capital market like SEC, Security Exchange, will focus on capital market development. Do you see that political where we can begin to say we'll have one revenue collecting agency? Do you see that possibility?
Thank you, but I don't agree with our proposals. I don't.
Okay.
We can have one federal inland revenue service to collect all federal revenues. I don't have a problem with that. However, if we are going to continue to run a federal system of government, then we should have revenue services for each state. So we should have revenue services for each state. And so what is important is a definition of what the federal government can collect and a definition of what the state government can collect. But I will not recommend a situation whereby the federal inland revenue becomes the Nigerian inland revenue, and then we have a very gigantic, powerful Nigerian revenue service for the whole nation. I do not agree with that proposal. We should have federal inland revenue to collect everything the federal government collects. Maybe whether it's customs, whether it's the NIMASA money or whatever it is, we can have that for the federal government. However, if I am a state governor, whether it's Lagos State, whether it's Anambra, whether it's Kano, whether it's Anambra, I want to have my own state revenue service to collect the revenue for my state. That is the only way you can have an effective federal system of government. I cannot be relying on a federal, somebody controlled and appointed by the president to collect my own state revenue for me. I don't agree with those proposals. So the proposal should be FRS can collect everything federal, but the state, we should know what the state is collecting and how the state is collecting. It should be defined in the reforms, and then we can improve the transparency, the clarity, and of course the accountability. But I do not agree that we should have a Nigeria revenue service for the whole country. 220 million people, corporate entities all over the country, personal income tax all over the country, collected by a single agency. No, that person or whoever has that agency becomes the second president of Nigeria.
Well, the committee also notes that there's going to be provisions for governance. The board will have governance, and also looks at the fact that the states, various state revenue services, will serve as departments. Are you saying that you disagree with that?
I don't want a department. They should be standalone. So let me tell you one way we can do it.
Okay.
For instance, let's say the federal government collects corporate, right, which is what they do at the moment, and the state collects personal income tax. My own recommendation actually would be, let federal government collect corporate, let state also have the responsibility and the legal authorization to also collect company income tax. However, for instance, you can then set the federal government collection as maximum of 15%, for instance. So the government can make changes around whether he collects 7% or he collects 14% or he collects 15%, but it can never be more than 15%, for instance. I mean, I'm just suggesting. Then you can also say the states can never collect corporate income tax that is more than 10%. But what is not important is that you are doing two things by coming up with that kind of measures or that kind of proposal. It means that each state now becomes responsible for growing and for developing the private businesses in their state. At the moment, they don't see it as their responsibility. Why? Because the resources of those businesses don't come to the state. Now, the second part of it is that by the time you start to share different taxes, whether it's corporate, whether it's personal income tax, with both federal and with both states, then it then means that you are forced to share data. So if I am Ogho Okiti Nigeria Enterprises, for instance, and I'm paying corporate income tax to federal government, say I'm paying 12%, and I'm paying 8% to the state will be aware of the 12% that has gone to federal. The federal will be aware of the 8% that has gone to the state. And the state will be able to judge, state and federal will be able to judge how many staff I have. Do you get my point? At the moment, the reason we are not able to grow the personal income tax is because there's a disconnection between the corporate income tax and the PIT. We need a situation where we need a combined measure program in such a way that state and federal government can share data, they can share resources. However, I will never support the proposal of a single national revenue service for the whole country. I think that would be overreaching.
All right, so Doctor, let's look at company income tax. We know that that's one very big, you just mentioned it, big source of revenue and all that. There's a proposition for a 5% reduction on CIT. Currently, CIT is 30%, so that will be 25% if passed as part of the propositions and signed. What is your take on that? Because businesses are very key in driving economic activities. And the tax, the CIT, is also a way of also encouraging or incentivizing them to invest. The committee said this is going to help them to incentivize them to further invest in the economy, create more jobs, and expand operations.
Okay, so for me, whether it's 25% or 30% is neither here nor there. What I'm interested in is the process. There must be a process to change it from time to time. And as long as that process is part of the legislation, I don't have a problem with that. So it is okay. It may be okay for us to have 25% now, but when it is okay for us to have 30%, do we have the legislative flexibility to change it at that point in time? That is all that matters in a legislation. I don't want our legislation or our proposals to be very, very rigid. Let's focus on the process, on the process by which the economy becomes dynamic. We can make changes as the time allows, or changes as conditions allow, or as the environment changes. So that is the most important in our legislation, and that should be the most important point. It's neither whether 25 or 30%, is neither here nor there. If it's 25 in 2024, no problem. I don't have a problem. But if you want to change it to 30% in 2028, do we have that legislative flexibility? That's my concern.
Very important, very important. Doctor, let's look at, of course, the issues of the priority incentive scheme. We know we have the pioneer investment tax schemes, and a lot of economists have been calling for broad-based sector incentive schemes for the business environment, the sectors. I know that Dr. Yemikale several years ago said we need a sector-based incentive scheme. Dr. Ayo Teriba has also been of the view, and a notable economist, that we need to reform that whole process, make it really work for the economy. What's your take about this pioneer investment schemes, priority incentive scheme taking over the pioneer investment scheme?
Okay, so I totally agree with, all the guys that you quoted. And I'm going back again to the process. So there are two major problems with what we call the pioneer incentives. Incentivizing investment in the last probably 10, 15, 20 years. One is that you don't know how long those schemes last. you just have this, they just have the scheme, and you don't know when they last. You don't know. It's like you are pioneer forever. That's number one. The second problem with it is obviously it's selective. It is selective. It's never industry-wide. It is just a group of people that have access to government, and they are able to collect whatever incentives that they can collect. And before you know it, they are able to actually shortchange the whole industry. And sometimes you have an oligopoly, or sometimes you have a monopoly. So that's number two. And the third aspect of it is that they are never measured, or you never have a review. So for instance, if the aim is to grow cassava, like cassava is doing well now. So let's say the aim is Nigeria is doing about 63 million metric tons at the moment. So let's say the aim is to double Nigerian production of cassava. So how do we measure that over the span of that incentives that have been provided? How do we measure that the companies that have been given those incentives are meeting the conditions of those incentives? So those are the three things. If you don't also have a legislation or a trade legislation that takes into consideration those flexibility and define the process for which these things happen, then you begin to have all these incentives just on the basis of somebody has gone to see Mr. President. And those are the things that make the president so powerful in a country like Nigeria, and it is not sustainable for our economy.
Yeah, it's not sustainable. And we need sector-wide interventions that will make our economy more broad-based. As we wrap up, Dr. Okiti, just recently, World Bank approved $2.2 billion loan. Of course, looking at Nigeria's reforms, the way of stabilizing the Nigerian economy. What's your take on this? Because the reason for this is, of course, what the finance minister and coordinating minister of economy, Mr. Waledu, said, that we have embarked on bold and necessary reforms to restore macroeconomic stability and put the country back on sustainable and inclusive economic growth path that will create quality jobs and economic opportunities for all Nigerians. How will this help to further reset the economy? and support some of the bold reforms. What is your advice to government at this time? Because we're all anticipating to see the layout of the accelerated stabilization plan, which the minister submitted to President Tinubu.
Okay, so I have argued, since last year, that wherever we can get, when you have a situation whereby the demand for the US dollar is inelastic and the supply for US dollar is also inelastic. So wherever you get the US dollar, in order to support that liquidity, for me, I will always welcome it. So I welcome the development. My only concern, and that's always been my concern since last year, my concern is that the heavy lifting for Nigeria stabilization efforts has been confined to monetary policy measures, tools, and elements. I have not seen any heavy lifting from the fiscal side. So from my understanding of the way they see these resources now, they see these resources as a budget support. But the way I would have seen the resources is to support the foreign reserves. That is where the problem is. It's not necessarily for me to spend it as part of budget, but to support foreign reserves accretion. So that you can begin to lessen the burden or the motivation from the monetary policy angle to continue to tighten and tighten and tighten. The reason the monetary policy is left without any choice but to tighten and tighten and tighten is because as they tighten, the fiscal policy side is just so loose and so weak at the moment. And in that way, you have a very, very, very strong imbalance. And that is why we see how the problem that we have. So how we encourage the Minister for Finance, I believe he's a very knowledgeable man. This is the time for fiscal side to also begin some heavy lifting in order for us to stabilize the economy further. The heavy lifting so far has been concentrated on monetary policy tools and elements.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ogho Okiti, economist and CEO of ThinkBusiness Nigeria, for this very insightful conversation on fiscal reforms and the pathway to inclusive economic growth in Nigeria. We hope to have you once again to talk about the journey so far, as we hope that the economy will be stabilized and Nigerians will breathe again and be smiling. Thank you once again for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. To our viewers, if you want to get further insights on this conversation, visit the ProShare website displayed on the screen and follow our social media platforms to engage further on this. To become your way again, enrich yourself with the knowledge of socio-economic developments around you, because it is a wise thing to do. I'm Ottoabasi Abasiekong. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.